7 p.m. It's always free. There's always a reception to follow. If you would, we really do read your input, and there are surveys on every chair. If you would fill those out, we really do take our visitors' feedback into account, and it helps us shape the program moving forward. I want to welcome you back next month, Tuesday, March 5. Mark Maurer, who's the Executive Director of the Sentencing Project, will be here at Eastern State discussing making a case for abolishing life sentences. He'll be talking about his new book, The Meaning of Life. He's an excellent speaker who was recently on the Daily Show with Trevor Noah. It's a great clip. I encourage you to check it out. It's very quick on the speed. It's really good. But tonight I want to welcome Brianna Remster. She is an assistant professor of sociology and criminology at Villanova University. She researches and teaches about crime, the social consequences of the prison move, and inequalities in criminal justice experience. She's going to be discussing the impact of incarceration on political representation and voting. So please join me in welcoming Brianna Remster.
Having me. It's great to be here tonight. It's a particular honor for me because I live in the neighborhood and I enjoy being part of the Eastern State community all year round. I should also acknowledge my colleague, Roy Kramer, who did this research with me. He's on his way right now from class from teaching today, so he will at least be here for the Q&A. But part of the reason why I Part of the reason. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Part of the reason why I do the work that I do is so that I can share it with folks like yourselves. So without further ado, I'm sure many of you in this room are familiar with figures like this and have seen, of course, the great graphic out on the yard, and so you know that the U.S. has the highest incarceration rate in the world. And importantly, it wasn't always this way. There are many consequences of incarcerating this many citizens. Tonight, I'm going to talk to you about how this system threatens modern democracy. So 2 pillars of modern democracy are universal suffrage, the right to vote, and equal representation, commonly known as the 1 person equals 1 vote rule. Yet mass incarceration threatens American democracy for 2 reasons. First, the U.S. is the only modern democracy where individuals convicted of a felony are prohibited from voting after they've been released from prison in many cases. The other way incarceration threatens democracy is that when apportioning political districts, most places in the U.S. count incarcerated persons as residents of the districts where they are incarcerated, and not the districts where they actually live, a practice sometimes termed prison gerrymandering. So tonight I'm going to review some research on what we know about felony disenfranchisement, its implications, and recent developments, before describing recent work of my own with my colleague Rory, looking at how mass incarceration distorts political representation here in Pennsylvania. So if you're interested in reading more about felony disenfranchisement, I highly recommend my colleagues' work, Chris Hugan at the University of Minnesota, and Jeff Manza's book, Locked Out, on the topic. But as of 2016, approximately 6.1 million Americans can't vote as the result of a felony conviction. And these policies disproportionately affect people of color. So 1 in 13 Black Americans is barred from voting, compared to 1 in 56 non-Black Americans. As you can see, felony disenfranchisement laws vary a lot by state. States in light green, which are just New Hampshire and Vermont, are the only states which have no such laws, meaning that even incarcerated persons can vote. States in dark green only prohibit voting while a person is incarcerated. This group includes Pennsylvania, and it comprises about 25% of states. States in dark blue ban voting until a person completes their sentence, including prison, parole, and probation. And that's about 36% of our states have this kind of law. States in light blue are states which ban incarcerated persons and formerly incarcerated persons for the first 5 years post-release. The pink states permanently disenfranchise people who've been convicted of specific offenses. And red states permanently ban all individuals with a felony conviction for life from voting. So together, the pink and the red states account for about 24% of states. Right? So about 1 in 4 states ban at least some people from voting for life. As to the origins of these laws, they have very ancient roots. But many strict U.S. felony voting laws are linked to racial conflict during the Civil War and Reconstruction periods. As Virginia's former Governor McAuliffe recently stated, felony disenfranchisement goes to the core of racism in this country. So you might be wondering, do these laws matter? Yes, they affect elections, but only in close Republican victories in states with very strict laws. So for example, felony voting bans likely affected the 2000 presidential election. If disenfranchised felons in Florida had been permitted to vote, Democrat Gore would certainly have carried the state and the election. An estimated 7 different Senate seats would also likely be different. But what about crime? Do felony disenfranchisement laws affect reentry and crime? Yes. There's a strong correlation between voting and recidivism. For example, individuals with a criminal record who voted were half as likely as those who didn't vote to be rearrested. And importantly, Americans don't support felon voting restrictions today. Polls show that at least 80% favor returning voting rights to former felons once they complete their sentences. And about 60% favor reenfranchising individuals on probation and parole. So what does the future look like for these laws? Personally, I'm optimistic. While we still have a long way to go to end felony disenfranchisement, a handful of states have eased their restrictions in the past decade or so. This is the result of growing awareness and understanding of the racial issues rooted in our criminal justice system, as well as support for the idea of second chances. Florida could be a major turning point in this issue. This past November, Florida passed Amendment 4, which restored voting rights to individuals with a felony record after completing their sentence, except individuals convicted of murder and sexual offenses. Florida previously had banned all individuals convicted of a felony for life. This change is the result of years of on-the-ground local grassroots organizing. Nearly 800,000 voters in Florida signed a petition to get Amendment 4 on the ballot. And the bill also had bipartisan support. Virginia and Alabama are other examples of recent states with big changes, although there's a series of them. As I'm sure many of you know, Virginia technically has the same policy as Florida used to, but Governor McAuliffe, former Governor McAuliffe, issued about 180,000 individual voting restorations for people who had completed their sentence before he left office a few weeks ago. And the possibly former new governor Northam has promised to continue this practice, right? As has his lieutenant governor, perhaps the new governor soon. So in addition to Virginia, another major victory was 2 years ago when Alabama passed a law which clearly specifies the crimes that prohibit a person from voting. Well, you might not think that's a big deal. It was at the time because Alabama had as their law, any crime that could be interpreted as affecting their moral turpitude was banned from voting. And as you can imagine, that kind of vague gray principle resulted in large-scale disenfranchisement and really uneven large-scale disenfranchisement across the state of Alabama. Importantly, emerging work shows that such changes make us safer. So for instance, voting, there's been research studying how voting rights restored in Virginia has increased citizens' trust in the government and the criminal justice system. This matters because more trust results in less crime. So we all benefit from more inclusive voting laws. I'm happy to discuss voting issues more during the Q&A, but for now I'm going to turn to a lesser known issue that might be just as impactful. So while many Americans are now aware of felon disenfranchisement as a result of hard work by activists, fewer are aware of how mass incarceration affects political representation. Rory and I have been studying how mass incarceration creates political inequalities long before elections occur. So long before people are either banned or permitted to enter a voting booth. As I mentioned a few moments ago, political representation is a critical component of our democracy. It allows democracies to be possible in large nation states like ours. Without it, we wouldn't be a democratic society. But the notion of representation has its own problems. How do we define that? As you might recall from grade school, political representation in the United States has always been controversial since the birth of the United States. When writing the Constitution, defining representation was heatedly debated among the delegates because the delegates couldn't agree on how to count enslaved populations. So the result was what's known as the 3/5 clause. Enslaved persons counted as 3/5 of a person for political apportionment until 1868, when the 14th Amendment abolished this practice. But even after the 14th Amendment passed, states continued to apportion districts unequally, with population sizes varying dramatically across districts. It wasn't until 1962, in Baker versus Carr, that the Supreme Court defined equal political representation formally as each person represents one vote. As a result, equal representation today is just based on population counts. In other words, you do not have to be eligible to vote under the Supreme Court's one person equals one vote rule. So even though incarcerated persons can't vote in 48 states, it doesn't matter for representation purposes because equal representation is based on total population counts. So the first step in order to ensure that equal political representation exists is those accurate population counts. Where do we get them? The census. In fact, the sole original purpose of the census was to obtain a complete count of the population for political district portioning. And to count our mobile populations, the census established what they call the usual residence rule, which requires people to be counted at the place where they live and sleep most of the time. Under this rule, incarcerated persons are counted at the correctional facilities where they are incarcerated. If prisons and incarcerated persons were randomly distributed across space and racial groups, then incarceration probably wouldn't affect political representation. But as many of you know, incarceration is heavily concentrated by both space and race. So most prisons are located in rural, predominantly white areas, while most incarcerated persons originate from urban, predominantly Black and Latinx areas. Up until the 1970s, there were so few people incarcerated that it probably didn't matter where they were counted. But despite the rapid expansion of the penal system, no adjustments have been made to how we count and where we count incarcerated persons. Although the census's enumeration policy continues to remain the same for incarcerated persons, changes have been made implementing how we count other mobile populations. So for instance, college students now get to choose whether to report their campus or their permanent address on their census form. And this change was made because, in part, college students, unlike incarcerated persons, can be active members of either community or both. The census has also revised how they count military personnel. that are stationed abroad. A population which shares many residency similarities with incarcerated persons. So military personnel overseas were affected in the Franklin versus Massachusetts Supreme Court decision, where the court wrote that individuals need not be physically present at the time of the census count, and that those with an allegiance, or what they called an enduring tie, could be included an enduring tie to a place could be included in the count. So, as I mentioned, military personnel and correctional populations share a lot in common. Both of them are what we call total institutions, which heavily restrict their physical surroundings and social interactions. Like service members abroad, incarcerated persons have little contact with the community in which they are incarcerated. Instead, both groups retain their social ties to their home communities. And physical barriers such as tall walls or fencing and a series of blocks separate incarcerated persons and service members from the surrounding area. In fact, because of how closed off total institutions are, legislators do not view incarcerated persons in their districts as their constituents. When polled, legislators from their home districts were incarcerated. When polled, legislators view prisoners from their home districts who are incarcerated elsewhere as their constituency more so than prisoners incarcerated in their districts who otherwise have no ties there. Taken together, these features suggest that incarcerated persons, like military personnel abroad, have an enduring tie to their home communities. Because we have about 2.1 million Americans behind bars, who are being counted in the districts where they are incarcerated, yet aren't meaningful members of those districts in any meaningful way, Rory and I wanted to know whether and how political representation in Pennsylvania would differ if incarcerated persons were counted in their home communities. This is sometimes called prison gerrymandering. You might have heard of prison gerrymandering because of the amazing work and publicity done by Peter Wagner and his colleagues at the Prison Policy Initiative. Several years ago, Peter Wagner and his colleagues began highlighting this issue, and most of their work looks at what representation would look like if incarcerated persons were not counted in the districts where they are incarcerated. Yet this is only half the issue, because the folks aren't just being counted elsewhere, they're also missing from their home districts. Indeed, scholars have been studying this, what we call the missing men problem, and how this affects communities of color. For political districting, though, these folks aren't just missing from their communities, they may actually be advantaging other communities. So we wanted to know what political representation would look like if incarcerated persons were counted in their home communities instead of the districts where they are currently incarcerated. I'm happy to talk more about the data and methods in the Q&A if folks are interested or afterward, but for now, we look at Pennsylvania State House districts. And Pennsylvania is pretty similar to the overall US concerning its incarceration rate, its racial demographics, and its urbanicity. And while Pennsylvania has a lot of state districts, 203 total, because it's a pretty big state in terms of population, it's not an outlier regarding to district size. So each district in the Pennsylvania House has roughly 60,000 residents. Turning to our findings, in total we find that 203 districts, 34 of them would gain or lose more than 837 residents if incarcerated persons were counted in their home communities instead of where they are held. For the non-statisticians in the room, 837 residents is one standard deviation above or below the average district change when we remove and return incarcerated persons. Let me show you what this looks like. So the districts highlighted in gray are districts which lose at least 837 residents when we remove prisoners from the districts where they are incarcerated and counted them in their home districts. As you can see, the gray districts are mostly rural districts located in central and western Pennsylvania. In contrast, the black districts on the map are districts which gain at least 837 new residents. And these districts which gain the most new residents are located in more urban areas, such as Pittsburgh, as well as Eastern PA, which includes former industrial cities like Allentown and Reading, and of course Southwestern PA where we are. Not only because we're here, but since Southeastern PA also contains nearly 1/3 of Pennsylvania's population, we're going to zoom in here so you can actually see what's going on. When we zoom into the Philly area, we can see that 3 districts, so the 2 kind of black blobs to the right are actually 3 districts. 2 of them are contiguous, which gain more than 837 residents. Shaded in black are located in the heart of Philadelphia's African American neighborhoods. District 70, which is northwest of Philly, also gains more than 837 new residents because it contains Morristown, which is predominantly a Black and Latinx municipality. There are also 3 districts we can see that lose more than 837 residents in southeastern PA. To the northwest of Philly is District 150, which many of you are familiar with because it contains Graterford State Correctional Institution, which is now SCI Phoenix, as well as Montgomery County's jail. To the southwest of Philly is District 160, which contains Chester County's jail, which is quite big. And northeast of Philly is District 173, which contains Philadelphia's massively large public jail facilities. Right? Taking these 2 maps together, we can see that geographically, the districts which lose the most residents are concentrated in predominantly white rural areas, whereas the ones that gain are generally more urban areas which generally have more people of color. Right? This means that political power is shifted away from urban areas to rural areas without adding a single voter to any district. So while we have 34 districts that experience a pretty substantial change when incarcerated persons are counted as members of the communities they inhabit, another way to estimate the impact of mass incarceration on political representation is to assess whether any of these districts are violating the Supreme Court's 1 person equals 1 vote rule. Maureen and I find that after incarcerated people are removed and returned, 4 districts are legally too small to qualify as a district while after incarcerated persons are returned. By the way Pennsylvania determines what district sizes should be is they take the total population of Pennsylvania, divide it by 203, and then each district has to be within 5% of in either direction. So 4 districts would have to be revamped considerably to be compliant with the Supreme Court's definition of equal representation. One of these 4 is District 150, which we just looked at a moment ago. District 150 loses the most residents of all 203 districts, over 5,000 residents, because it contains SCI Phoenix and Montgomery County's jail. The other 3 are District 19, which contains Pittsburgh's largest jail, District 88, which has SCI Camp Hill. Camp Hill is the state's largest intake facility for incarcerated men. And District 63 contains SCI Forest. So again, there's a strong geographic pattern here. 3 of those 4 districts are located outside of urban areas. Only Pittsburgh's jail doesn't fall into that category. In addition to our 4 districts that are too small, we also find 4 districts that would legally be too large if incarcerated persons were counted in their home communities and not where they're incarcerated. And all 4 districts in violation are urban or include a central city in a rural county. Sorry, not yet. Districts 197, 179, and 203 are located in Philadelphia, and 71 contains Johnstown, which is a city in an otherwise rural county. Okay. Those 4 districts contain 264,000 Pennsylvania residents. In other words, we find that mass incarceration has resulted in 264,000 Pennsylvania residents being constitutionally underrepresented. And because of who is incarcerated, Black Pennsylvanians are disproportionately impacted. In fact, over 100,000 Black residents of Philadelphia do not experience representational equality as defined by the Supreme Court because of mass incarceration. That's roughly 20% of Philadelphia's total Black population. Additionally, 3 of the 4 districts that grow too large are majority minority districts. So if prisoners are counted as living in their home community, there's a substantial likelihood that an additional majority minority district in Philadelphia would be necessary to satisfy the Voting Rights Act requirements. So it's clear that Blacks in Philly are affected, but what about people of color across the state? And how are whites affected across the state? So we did one last analysis to examine how this policy impacts race and ethnicity, looking at how counting incarcerated persons in their home communities affects representation for the average white versus non-white Pennsylvania resident. This figure shows that prison location benefits the typical white Pennsylvania resident's representation, while simultaneously weakening the average Black and Latinx Pennsylvania resident's representation. In fact, the average white person's district would lose roughly 59 individuals with incarcerated persons counted in their pre-prison districts. And the average Black person's district in Pennsylvania would gain 353 new residents. Similarly, the average Latinx person district would gain approximately 313 new residents. In short, Black and Latinx voters are being diluted in comparison to white residents voters because Black and Latinx persons are less likely to live in districts in which incarcerated persons inflate the number of non-voting residents compared to whites. So on average, white Pennsylvania residents' voters, their votes matter more than Black and Latinx residents' voters because of where they live. In summary, my research shows that mass incarceration distorts political representation in a couple of ways in Pennsylvania. There are 4 districts that are constitutionally too small to be a district. All 4 of those are either rural or suburban. Second, Black and Latinx residents' political representation is diluted because they're disproportionately spread across geographic regions, and incarcerated persons are the only Americans moved forcibly by the state across legislative boundaries. And finally, urban residents are constitutionally underrepresented, as 3 of the 4 districts that are too large constitutionally are urban. While political representation is a bedrock of modern democracy, representative American democracy is also unfortunately defined by its racial ideology. From the 3/5 compromise to recent efforts like voter ID laws, this has long been a tradition. There's been, for instance, a lot of attention to racial gerrymandering, which is known as the process of drawing district boundaries around stable residential populations. And for good reason, we've been paying attention to racial gerrymandering, right? But our work uncovers a form of racial gerrymandering that occurs before political boundaries are drawn by how we count incarcerated persons. So while racial representation was supposedly resolved in the 1960s via the Voting Rights Act and a series of Supreme Court cases, today, racial underrepresentation has reemerged via a racialized system of punishment. Because the number of people we incarcerate, and because we disproportionately incarcerate people of color, because of how we count these folks for district apportionment, mass incarceration is helping reproduce racial inequality. The good news is that unlike other drivers of racial inequality, like poverty or health, political representation is a form of racial inequality that can more easily be remedied. Several years ago, there was a movement to have the census count incarcerated persons in their home communities for the 2020 census. We've heard about that. Although the census invited public comments on the issue, and nearly 100,000 Americans responded, including a group of senators, no changes have been made for the 2020 census. So it's up to states. Fortunately though, as of 2010, the census began separating out individuals living in correctional facilities. So all states have to do is subtract those individuals from the districts with those facilities and then use their pre-PRISM addresses to count them in their home communities when we're doing political apportionment. Today, Maryland, New York, California, and Delaware, with multi-state collaboration and adequate resources and planning, have counted incarcerated persons at their pre-PRISM addresses and redistricted accordingly. A number of local municipalities across the country have also changed how they count incarcerated persons for political apportionment. Some of the consequences of mass incarceration have been what we call unintentional. For instance, when tough on crime initiatives were implemented, there wasn't a whole lot of thought given to how those coming out of prison would be pretty unemployable because their job skills would languish while they were incarcerated. In contrast to things like that, banning individuals from voting and banning and counting incarcerated persons to advantage some groups' political representation while disadvantaging other groups' political representation, those policies are intentional. The right to vote and equal political representation are fundamental pillars of modern democracy. Yet our research and my colleagues' research shows that mass incarceration has distorted these fundamental pillars. What are we going to do about it? Thanks very much for having me. I kept this as short as possible so that we could have some great discussion and dialogue, hopefully. Thank you. Oh, and Lori's here over there in the corner.
We'll try to repeat your question after you answer the How does the United States compare with other countries in terms of allowing incarcerated?
For voting? Sorry, she asked how the United States compares to other countries in terms of allowing people to vote who are incarcerated. So it depends. There are a handful of countries that bar currently incarcerated persons, so only while you're locked up from voting. But they're actually not the norm. Most countries around the world who have democratic processes and their citizens are voting do not prevent currently incarcerated persons from voting whatsoever. The US is unique because we have those varying restrictions that are not just while you're incarcerated for 48 states, but also after you're released, how long, and then in some cases the type of offense that you commit.
Several states that have changed. What is that required change of legislation or is it just a policy?
It's legislation, but you see both examples, right? And so that's been kind of interesting to watch where people are cobbling together what works in their state specifically. So you saw Florida, that was a ballot initiative where 800,000 people signed the template to demand that it get on the ballot. That's what qualified it to be, so that 66% of all Florida voters then decided that they wanted to pass the law, right? So that's an example of a direct ballot initiative. Versus in Virginia, for example, that was the governor, who, as many of you might know, initially tried to have an executive order to just change the law directly, and it was knocked down by his Supreme Court, which then involved, that's why he went to having to very slowly and tediously individually restore all of those folks' voting rights. And most governors have the right to do that. And so it's a very interesting kind of backdoor, or it's not used nearly as much as it could, where governors hold the power to restore voting rights and they don't use it very much, right? But it is certainly an important mechanism where they could create change now, tomorrow, without having to wait around for a law to pass.
2 questions on that last point. Can a subsequent governor reverse that ruling?
Yes.
Okay, so
Absolutely, which is a very serious concern in Virginia, right? So we're kind of holding our breath. I mean, Virginia has leaned Democratic, for a while, and so given the momentum and excitement and notoriety, quite frankly, that they've gotten for doing this, I would be surprised to see a Democratic governor come in, but that doesn't mean it can't happen. You're absolutely right.
Secondly, you mentioned several areas where constitutionality is involved. So what are the prospects for a constitutional challenge to any of these situations?
Somebody needs to file a lawsuit, right?
And why has that not been done?
Not enough public awareness, and not enough resources in the hands of people who are affected to make that happen. Right?
Yeah, Pennsylvania to Governor Wolf, stop signing.
So Governor Wolf could start, well, okay, in Pennsylvania we have the least restrictive, other than, Pennsylvania only restricts people who are currently incarcerated. Could he individually re-enfranchise all the currently incarcerated people? I'm not sure, I'd have to check. That's an interesting question. And then you have a follow-up, you have another part. No, that was it.
What did Governor Wolf do with regards to the
So in Pennsylvania, so it varies by state. In Pennsylvania, there's an independent redistricting commission that draws our districts after a new census comes out, right? So we're getting ready after we get the 2020 census, then they will go and do the whole redistricting. And so I believe it's a strong say in who's on that redistricting committee, could advocate heavily that he would like prisoners removed, that he would like the how Pennsylvania is counting their prisoners to be differently.
we need new legislation?
Rory, what do you think?
Knew you were going to come through with that. The not really an answer that I'm going to give you is he could try to do it without legislation, but it would probably end up like the 2010 redistricting in that it would be a lawsuit for 6 to 8 years, and who knows what the end result of that would be because it's a elected Supreme Court as well, and I don't think any elected Supreme Court is going to not find a reason to vote in the direction of its majority party. So if it's a Democratic Supreme Court in Pennsylvania after 2020, it would probably support this, and if it was a Republican Supreme Court, it would probably find a reason why we needed legislature as opposed to just executive action. I don't know which is legally, technically more correct than opinion.
In your section on remedial efforts, you indicated that certain states and jurisdictions could just take account of the individuals that are incarcerated, subtract it out, and then reapply it to their last previous stress. But a phenomenon that has happened in the last 40 years, coincident with the rise of increased numbers of incarceration, increased racialization of incarceration, has been shuttering of mental health facilities and the drastic speaking up of individuals that are not necessarily criminals, but are finding themselves encountered with law enforcement because of their mental health services. So I'm thinking of individuals that homeless for long periods of time, that have probably traversed the entire United States, and their last name is available. Is that a problem that doesn't really need investigation in your research, or is that something that's being creatively addressed? Thank you.
I think you're absolutely right to point out that state correctional data sources are usually not the most up-to-date, best kept records that we have. And that's a matter of resources and priorities, that there has not been a strong reason for why they needed to keep updated addresses. I mean, if you're on probation or parole, they do need an address. I don't think it matters. So it's completely possible, in my opinion, to have the data to return prisoners accurately.
First, I would say some people should not ever regain the right to vote if they are public officials convicted. We currently know of examples right here in Philadelphia, in both parties, to the House, but there also.
We do.
That's one move I was allowed to get. The other group,
And the felon disenfranchisement laws, the states that have specific criminal conviction offenses, I can guarantee you that corruption is not one of them. Second question.
people in the polling place were preventing people from voting and allowing people who have no right to vote 3 or 4 times. Cook County is famous for voting early and often. That shouldn't be allowed either. If you want to, and we have it right here in Philadelphia, voter suppression of Republicans, in fact, North Philadelphia. The Republicans are the ones that have violence used against people from voting. And that's another group. If you're preventing from people voting, whether you're black, white, Oriental, I don't care. You shouldn't be doing that with citizens. Now, if you're doing something about people who aren't citizens, different issue.
So I can speak to relating to people who live in states that have recently changed their disenfranchisement laws. There's mass confusion because people are so terrified of because it is a federal it's a felony for voting when you cannot, which can land you with 5 years in prison. And so there's actually mass undervoting among newly enfranchised populations because people are scared and not quite sure about the details and who it affects and whether it affects them. And so there's a growing number of grassroots organizations that are trying to get out there and say, hey, you can vote, and here's the information, here's how you do it, so that people can take advantage of these changes that have been happening.
So the slide that you had with the increase of votes in white communities of like 52 or so on average. Yeah, that reflects, I think, the ways that this policy promotes unearned privileges for white folks at the direct expense of people of color. But for the folks who benefit from things the way they are, especially in the divisive, nature of, well, politics always, but now also, how would you express to white folks in communities that are rural and perhaps also conservative, where the scapegoating of people of color and the blaming of people of color would make it difficult to perceive this as actually achieving equity that's deserved for those communities that have been underrepresented and disenfranchised, that it's not like taking something away from them unfairly? How do you help to reshape that conservative false narrative?
It's very difficult, and that's why we have the policy that we do, right? And I don't mean to underestimate how, well, the actual counting process is not that hard. The movement and agreement to change the counting process is incredible. You might remember James Carville famously described for Bob Casey's Cooper governorship campaign in the 80s. Sorry, say that word. He described Pennsylvania as Philadelphia and Pittsburgh with Alabama in between, right? And so people are talking past each other. They have no, I mean, that's the white privilege that you speak of is absolutely enjoying it at a cost to other people. And so it's about equality. It's not about loss of privilege. And so if we truly believe in our Constitution and the Supreme Court's rulings, then every person has the right to be counted equally. And that doesn't apply to whether you are incarcerated. And so I think conservatives are strong, fans of our Constitution. This is a direct interpretation, by the Supreme Court on what representation means, and we're not complying. Right? This isn't some crazy idea out of nowhere that's brand new. Right? This is.
Talk about it a little bit more. So that we're on the budget line. Other lawmakers out there who are actively thinking to integrate
Yes.
in our district for this exact purpose.
Absolutely. And I think that really speaks to how economically we're struggling these days, that folks, politicians are, vying to have a prison. People want to have a prison in their district because they think it guarantees jobs, right? That's how, and unfortunately, the long-term research shows that after that prison is built by workers that are brought in, right, and then leave, there's very mixed research on whether it actually helps communities, right? We know that unfortunately correctional officers are incredibly underpaid. It's not like we're talking about long-term stability, great living wage jobs. And so it speaks to the state of our economy that legislators are working really hard to lobby to get a prison in their district because it's what their constituents want, right? And I don't think there's not a lot of active consideration about how it's going to affect the voting. It's about having jobs and industry in your neighborhood.
Sorry. So your research is very interesting and valuable. Could you tell us a little bit about some groups who are using it to affect policy here in Pennsylvania or nationwide?
So there's a growing, largely through the prison policy initiatives, work highlighting. They have tried to go through states as well as local municipalities and say, hey, this really matters. We have districts that when we take the people out, you don't qualify as a district. Like there are places in Iowa, there are literally 3 actual voters just had, and they have a jail, and they interview them and show these, really shareable YouTube videos of people laughing, saying, they're the only 3 voters in their district. And that's bringing attention to how, what a big issue this is. In Pennsylvania, there is the, it's basically in the name, the fair, what is the, thank you, that is not currently focusing very much on this, to my knowledge. So if you think that they should, you should definitely suggest that. I can tell you that there has been interest from national organizations by as having Pennsylvania be the kind of challenge suit that someone mentioned a few minutes ago, right? As a potential. It's not happening yet, right?
You feel that the way the census is run is out of date?
Yes.
And are there,
You just heard every social scientist nod all at once.
what are some proposals of maybe new ways to
So, yeah, that was really interesting. A handful of years ago when a group of people got together and started saying, you know, we understand, with all due respect, when you started collecting the census, that's in 1790, we barely had anyone incarcerated. So it clearly was not a priority, it's to no one's fault that this policy is no longer working today. You know, but we have mass incarceration now, and unfortunately, it's really distorting our political apportionment, which is the sole purpose of the census, right? We're not just using it for something else as as an additional add-on sort of thing. This is what it's originally intended to do. Yes, I think it's very outdated, and I think you see other issues like questions about citizenship. The census is under a lot of fire right now. And should it be different? There's lots of reasons to suggest that it should, because without accurate data, you know, we use the census as social scientists for so many different things. And I have not specifically mentioned tonight that I focused on political districting because that's what Warren and I did. But many of you know that part of the reason why these population counts matter so much is because of resource funding, right? And it's tricky in terms of how prisons are affecting those resource funding formulas for how money is distributed within the state. Because in some situations you have, you know, prisons clearly using the water, right? But of course, they're not using the schools, the roads, you know, and so it's a complicated situation, but you could see multiple uses, right, with having more accurate census data. Yes, in the back?
I believe that, in prisons, inmates are counted to bring more funding to that area.
Mm-hmm.
They count the inmates in those prisons, in those areas, as people in that area, so that they can get more funding
Mm-hmm.
for their town, city, county, or wherever.
That's a possibility. I mean, I can't speak to, I don't know, you know, the inner workings of these decisions, but I think it is very striking to your point that we count these people in those districts. Another option would be to just not count them in the districts. Obviously, that's only half the solution because they're missing from the districts in North and West Philly. But
But they actually counted in the Northeast.
right,
And the
exactly,
Northeast gets
right?
more funding.
But they're not meaningful residents of the communities in rural white Pennsylvania. And we're, yeah, you're exactly right. Yes.
So you discussed how much of a lack of awareness there is about this topic, and I feel that because I didn't know. And I feel like we kind of exemplify the disproportionate incarceration rates of Black and brown people and things like that. And these times are also play a key role. So in what ways do you think would bring about awareness? Or in what ways do you feel like we as a community can start bringing about awareness to spark the change?
Knowledge is power, right? You're all here tonight, and that's awesome. And you know people, and when it comes up in conversations, I mean, that's how most of the reforms, I mean, come on, that's how we got Larry Krasner, right? Is through people, you know, coming together and saying that something is a problem and organizing at the ground level is where, and then of course electing and appointing people that are gonna be willing to make change. I think we have to think carefully about how much having a system like this affects everybody. There's often it doesn't affect me, I don't know anyone who's incarcerated situation. No, this kind of work shows that everyone, right? Especially people of color, but no one is getting equal representation under this with having this massive system. Right? So don't stop talking about it and thinking about it is really important in my opinion.
Please join me in thanking Brianna Remster.